Fantasy football, man's favorite excuse for ignoring their girlfriends. It feels like over the past 10 years, fantasy football has just exploded onto the scene. Kind of the same way that Deshaun Watson exploded into that massage chair, except fantasy football is less sticky. According to Fox Sports, fantasy football is a $70 billion industry. If it were a country, it would have the 68th highest GDP in the world. A recent study conducted by Sports Illustrated found that the number of fantasy football players has jumped 25% in the past year alone. Because of this, I thought that today would be a fun time to talk about what fantasy football is, what daily fantasy sports are, and what the differences are between the two so that you can decide on whether or not you want to get in on the action. So, let's start at the beginning. You might find this hard to believe, but fantasy football has been around since the 1960s. In 1962, three men who were part of the Oakland Raiders organization created the first known fantasy football league. It was called the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League, or GOPPPL. You know, you really should start reverse engineering these things. Like, you could have easily called your league Draft, the Dynamic Roster Assembly and Fantasy Tournament, or you could have named it Glory, the Great League of Rivals Yearning, or even Anus, the Alliance of Noble Underdog Squad. Why? Because that's exactly where you pulled this disaster of a name from. But even though they had a terrible name, they had an amazing concept. The concept of fantasy football is simple. You meet in a room, you draft an imaginary team of real NFL players, and then you track their stats. As the games happen in real life, your players earn points based on how well they performed, and at the end of the season, the team with the most points wins. The problem with that was that tracking player statistics in the 1960s was really hard because they had to record everything manually. The concept of fantasy football didn't gain wider recognition until the 1980s, when the internet provided a platform for websites to offer automated scoring and real-time stat updates. So yes, the internet can be used for other things besides Pornhub. Advancements in technology also gave birth to dedicated fantasy football platforms and mobile applications like the ones that we use today. In traditional fantasy football, league members or managers have to draft a team before the season starts. Draft day is typically the day that everyone spends all of their offseason research time researching for. Why? Because after a manager drafts their team, they're stuck with that same team for the next 16 weeks. Fantasy players will then have to manage their teams through injuries, bye weeks, trades, suspensions, and other factors over the course of the season. Now, like I said before, as the game happens in real life, your players will earn points based off of how well they perform in real life. So to help you understand that basic concept, let's do a simple breakdown. Let's say your running back runs for 100 yards and a touchdown. If your league scores yardage at 1 point per 10 rushing yards, which is pretty standard, and 6 points for a rushing touchdown, then that 100-yard, one touchdown performance would amount to 16 fantasy points. Pretty simple, right? Fantasy football gained popularity due to its ability to engage fans on a deeper level, encouraging them to follow games beyond their favorite teams or players. But more recently, traditional fantasy football players have been turning their attention to daily fantasy sports. In 2022, FanDuel reported $3.2 billion in revenue. One aspect of DFS that separates it from traditional fantasy football is the potential for immediate cash prizes. While traditional fantasy football often revolves around season-long bragging rights, daily fantasy sports allows players to compete for real money in each contest that they enter. Think of your traditional fantasy football season as kind of like a story mode, and daily fantasy sports is kind of more like mini games. In traditional story mode, you have to play the entire game, get all the way through it to find out what's going to happen at the end, and that takes time and commitment. But in minigame mode, you can play a ton of different games back to back to back, and there is no commitment. Once the minigame is over, you know immediately who won. But even though you do have a chance of instant gratification playing minigames in daily fantasy sports, remember that the odds aren't really in your favor. One study conducted by the Fantasy Sports Trade Association found that 1% of daily fantasy sports players win an average of 34% of prize pools. 14% end up breaking even, and 85% of players end up losing money in daily fantasy sports. So whether you choose traditional fantasy football or venture into the realm of daily fantasy sports, fantasy leagues bring together friends, families, and colleagues to give you a sense of community and provide a safe place for spirited shit-talking. So gather up your friends, fire up the draft boards, and let the fantasy football adventures begin.